Morning, everyone. We've started recording, so if you have colleagues who are unable to attend, this recording will go out, and so they'll be able to find this information as well. So welcome. My name is Janelle Branham. I'm the Senior Program Manager for MassEC. Today, I will be presenting, as will Bill Jordan. We'll be doing the bulk of the presentation on these kind of low training, high potential to earn and high demand careers, as well as my colleague Beverly Craig. So I guess if we could just move forward a slide. So here at MassEC, we have four main focus areas: high performance buildings, clean transportation, net zero grid, and offshore wind, all of which are supported by our efforts to increase the talent pipeline for the clean energy sector and just invest in Massachusetts in ways that'll make it so that this is growing and will meet our decarbonization goals for 2050. So currently, if you are on this call, hopefully you already heard that we have some open solicitations. The first one is the grant for minority and women-owned business support or enterprises support, and that is the first round of grants for that are due on by the 29th of April, and we are in a process where if you have questions, please make sure you reach out to us at this point using workforce@massec.com. That is the mailbox that is monitored. The other one, exciting, is our planning grants for workforce equity groups came out today. And that is up to $50,000 to really do some planning that'll target environmental justice neighborhoods, as well as developing the workforce pipeline for employers for this targeted population. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Phil.
Terrific. Thank you, Janelle. Thank you all for being here. It's my real pleasure to be here to talk to you all today about some of the high priority occupations that we see coming forward from this clean energy transition and really driven by those focus areas that Janelle mentioned. So this is the first of two webinars where we'll be talking about high priority occupations. This first webinar is looking at really the shorter term training and those jobs that require less experience. So perhaps we could say sort of lower barriers to entry from a training perspective. And we will be sort of discussing a whole range of sort of activities that are specific to clean energy. Just to give a quick overview. So we are looking at key priority occupations based on some work that we completed for New York. NYSERDA just produced a Just Transition Working Group job study where we modeled out sort of different climate scenarios to reach New York's 2050 goals. We are in the process currently of doing the same for Massachusetts, but the sort of the broader takeaways are the same. What we see is really strong growth over the next really 30 years, but accelerating very quickly, starting now, really, around buildings and renewables. So we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about those two core segments, and including some with storage, because those are really some very high demand, high growth sectors. We're going to talk a lot about building electrification. And so, what does that mean? That means sort of the heating and air conditioning and other ventilation activities for commercial and residential buildings. It's the shell or the envelope of the building, how to make that more energy efficient and airtight. And then other sort of residential activities around things like water heating and cooking, household appliances. We'll get into roofing a little bit, right? Some of the other, which is really sort of part of shell, but there are other aspects that we can look at that really are sort of the key opportunities that we see coming out of this growth. So my slides are a little slow here, but I think we'll want to look at some of the short-term training and low experience requirement jobs today. And as I mentioned, really focusing on that buildings, renewables, and storage. So we're going to talk about 6 specific occupations today and go through a lot of the detail on what we know about these occupations and why they would be important for focus, especially as we think about opportunities in environmental justice communities. So we're going to talk about carpenters. We're going to talk about crane and tower operators, pile driver operators, wind turbine technicians, with a note that these are really geographically specific to the South Shore. These are jobs that are going to be disembarking from the coast, insulation workers, and then hazardous material removal workers. And this is a big emphasis on those retrofits that are going to be so important for Massachusetts to meet its goals. Within the occupations, the first thing I'm going to do is just sort of talk a little bit about what those roles look like, right? So what does a carpenter do and how is it relevant to clean energy and how is it going to play out? And then we'll get into some detailed data around wages and benefits. What are some of the typical requirements for hiring? Some of the certifications that have value, and then those knowledge, skills, and abilities that are important for training providers to make sure that they are focusing on for workers. So one of the really important takeaways here is that for 5 of the 6 occupations that we're looking at a median, and all 6 at the entry level, pay more than the Massachusetts average wage. So when we look at all occupations and we say, take a cross section of all of every job in Massachusetts, the 10th percent earning is $13.67 an hour. The median is $25.75, and the senior, the 90th percentile, is at $63.63 per hour. So that's our benchmark. That's all jobs across the Commonwealth. And what we see here is really significantly higher entry-level earnings, as well as significantly higher median earnings across the categories. We also focused on a couple of occupations, really 3 occupations, where we think there's a potential to start or own your own business. That is, again, a lower barrier to entry. So thinking about the 2 Mass CEC solicitations, the one sort of focused on MWBE owned enterprises and the second around planning grants, we hope there'll be some information for everybody here that's useful, but specifically around carpenters, installation workers, and hazmat removal workers. There are good opportunities here to start businesses, as well as just having occupational careers. We can go into more detail and I can answer any questions you have about where the data come from, but I think suffice to say that this is a data that comes from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics or the US Department of Energy. So the first thing I want to do is sort of put a little bit of level setting when we talk about buildings. And so here's just a single family home, could be anywhere. And I want to just talk a little bit about what we mean by electrification and efficiency. So what we see here is really a standard home, and this is a heat map, right? So basically you can use a thermal imaging application to see where there's heat loss coming from a home, right? So you have a hot indoors, cold outdoors, right? And you want to see how quickly is that heat escaping as we think about energy efficiency. And the first thing that I'll sort of point out to you here is that you can see every stud in this house, right? And that's because wood is a very good conductor of energy, meaning that a lot of heat can escape a house through wood, as opposed to insulation, which goes in between those wood slats that you see where the framing of the house is. So you put all this insulation in, but then you do nothing for the wood, right? So one of the things, in order for Massachusetts to meet its climate goals and to save the kind of energy that it needs to save in order to reduce its emissions, is to have less heat loss coming from homes. Well, how do you do that? You use advanced shell or envelope techniques so that you're finding ways of insulating around that wood, right? So that you're breaking that thermal bridge and you're losing less of the heat out into the environment. You can see the windows here very clearly, right? Obviously, new windows and efficient windows being installed. Those are things that can be fabricated and installed at millwork sites and then installed by contractors and carpenters. And the more efficient the window is, the less heat loss. The heating, ventilation, and air conditioning is another key factor that we'd be looking at in buildings. So when we have inefficient old heating systems, whether it's for hot water, whether it's for forced hot water for heating, air conditioning, traditional central air conditioning or window units, or furnaces burning fossil fuels, a lot of that heat goes up out through the chimney, right? And that ranges in a lot of percentages. But when you're burning fossil fuels, a lot of that heat and a lot of those fossil fuels actually go right up through the stack. Many new technologies exist that actually don't create heat or cold at all. They just move heat around and do so very efficiently. So as part of Massachusetts' plan to decarbonize its economy, heat pumps, both air source heat pumps, which you see are those mini splits, right? That if you've ever been to Europe, they've been very popular for a long time, and increasingly we see them in other applications like hotels, right? Where maybe each room has its own unit that's highly efficient, or a whole home system that has those outdoor condensers that look somewhat like the current central air conditioning systems that we see flipped on their sides. You've seen those around, as well as the geothermal ground source heat pumps is another way of thinking about these applications, are much more efficient. And they're really very different skill sets that are required than when we're talking about burning fossil fuels. So HVAC is going to be a critical component, as well as water heating. So similar to the heating of the home, when you are burning fossil fuels to do that, or using resistance heating, you're generating a lot of heat. A lot of that heat dissipates away from the water, either up a chimney or just out into the ambient air. And the newer technologies really focus having a lot more of that energy usage go towards its purpose, which is heating water for domestic use. So this is sort of what we're talking about, right? And it's not like we're creating dozens of new occupations. We're focusing on occupations where people are already doing these things. We just need them to do them a little bit differently so that we can maximize the efficiency of the home. The carpenter is still going to build walls that look much like those. We'll get into that in a moment about how they could build those walls slightly differently to lose less heat. So really, that's a key takeaway to start off with, is that what we're really thinking about, and this image I think is important to that, is how do we make this house look blue because it's saving so little energy is escaping out into the environment, and it's all staying where it belongs in the home to keep it comfortable. And what kinds of skills do the people who are currently building or retrofitting homes need in order to help facilitate that more efficient future? Okay. Next, we come to renewables and storage. That's the other area where we see lots of growth potential, given Massachusetts' strong commitment. A number of us were over at the wind testing blade facility last week to hear Governor Baker talk about Massachusetts' leadership in renewables and a renewed commitment in Massachusetts to stay on top. There's going to be a lot of deployment of renewable technologies. And we have a very interesting history in Massachusetts as really being an early leader in renewables, but also being one that does not have any sort of fossil fuels to extract. So all of the gasoline, all of the natural gas, all of the, well, not coal anymore, but previously coal, or other fuel types, propane, diesel, all of those things that we would combust is all money that we would be sending out of state, right? Because we didn't have any of those things here. So they'd be coming out of Texas or some other country or some other state. And what we're really focusing on now with this transition from a high level is how do we become, as a state, energy independent? And renewables are a very important way, and storage are very important ways for us to get there. So what are we really talking about? Where are the biggest jobs? Well, the first two are really the big job categories that we see emerging in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is already a leader in the solar industry, lots of jobs in the solar industry, which we expect will continue and increase as we deploy more and more solar systems. There may be some tweaks as we start thinking about the expansion of utility scale and community scale solar on how the business models might shake out. But most of the skill profiles would be similar. We just may need lots more of them. Offshore wind is a really different category of job creation, and one that I think is really exciting, because for the first time in a long time, we're talking about creating new industries, not just in America, but really in our backyard, right here in Massachusetts. So the types of jobs, and we're going to be talking about a lot of these in this discussion today. The types of jobs that we're creating are not ones that have been easily created in our neck of the woods for a long time. So things around fabrication and assembly and manufacturing, as well as many construction trades. So offshore wind is a big one, and we're going to spend a lot of time focusing on that. This actually is a photograph of the Block Island wind farm, which is not too far from our coast. We're very excited about Massachusetts' commitment to build the first commercial large-scale offshore wind plant in the United States, and a number of solicitations and commitments to really build on that momentum. So really exciting opportunities there. We also see some real excitement around storage, whether it's behind the meter batteries. That means storage batteries that could fit within someone's home, where they could have a backup source of power, and where the utilities can better regulate supply and demand, as well as utility scale batteries, which are much bigger battery systems that utilities can deploy. Because if we use a lot of solar and offshore wind, we need to make sure that we're able to smooth out those times when we need a lot of energy, and times when we're not producing as much. So the classic example is producing electricity from a solar panel at night is pretty challenging, but if you have a battery backup, it helps to smooth all that out. I did also include hydrogen and bioenergy. These are not things that you're going to want to focus on, likely, particularly hydrogen, not something you want to focus on in this upcoming solicitation. But it's something we think that it's worth keeping an eye on over the next 8 to 15 years, which probably seems like a lifetime to many of you who are thinking about making an immediate impact. But these are going to be also big new investments in industries that we see as being critical to the energy transition. So we just wanted to mention them in terms of their longer term importance, and also making sure that as we're thinking about the full pipeline of having the workforce locally, and making sure that that workforce is available in Massachusetts and available to all communities in Massachusetts, thinking about some of the K through 12 interventions that would be important around hydrogen, bioenergy, and all these other technologies for those longer term plays are critical. But I'm not going to focus too much here today on those types of opportunities. All right, so let's get into it. We have a list of occupations that we're going to talk about. So you remember that picture that I showed you of the house when you could see every stud? This picture in the middle is an example of carpenters building a double stud wall. So what that means is you can insulate the area in between all of the studs that you see in the existing wall that's sort of standing up already, as well as the new wall that they're installing, and it's offset. So there'll be insulation in between each stud. So when the warm air from the house comes, it hits that barrier of insulation, and where the wood goes through, that has insulation behind it. So essentially, you are breaking that thermal bridge, and you're creating a much more energy efficient home. What you see here is that this is a technique where obviously the carpenters are going to need to be factoring that in terms of their approach, their measurements, their calculations, but it's still a wall that looks pretty similar to what a carpenter would build. It's just about knowing when to use which application when, and what in which situation. So that's an example of a very important way for new construction that we can be thinking about building more efficient homes, where it's sort of a minor tweak in how carpenters currently do things. On the retrofit side, right, because we have a lot of building stock that's not going to be going away, and it's not all going to be new construction. Another way to do it is to add insulation or insulated sheathing to the outside of the house when you re-side it. For that, a carpenter is going to need to do the same types of calculations to be thinking about how do they have the right type of equipment and fasteners necessary to make sure that they're thinking about the extra weight that those things could be producing, as well as the extra width that they need to get through to make sure that they're hitting a secure point. So again, it's more about those sort of calculations. It's not a dramatic shift in those skills. And it's not even something that's sort of outside of the realm of, certainly not outside of the realm of what a carpenter does, still very much what a carpenter does. It's just a tweak in terms of understanding some of the techniques so that we can be building and renovating our homes to be more efficient. So those are some of the examples. I mean, another good example of what carpenters do in this space would be that when we talked about windows, new windows, right? Carpenters are often the ones producing the framing and installing the window itself to making sure that it's a snug fit. So that's more work. Again, very similar skill profile. In fact, there's nothing that's different except maybe some weight calculations depending on where in the state we are. But really nothing very different at all from installing an energy efficient window to a non-energy efficient window. But obviously that's going to create a lot of work for carpenters, so it's going to impact the demand. There are a couple other areas about thinking about carpenters and where they play roles that I think are important for us to think about that are outside of just this sort of residential framing that I've sort of talked about. Carpenters are experts at building forms, concrete forms and other types of forms for foundations. So this has a lot of application, not only in the residential market, but also in commercial buildings. Carpenters play a very important role in building those forms, but they also play an important role in offshore wind, where they are creating the forms for many of the foundations, particularly where there are concrete foundations for those types of projects. One of the interesting aspects about offshore wind is that pretty soon we run out of land, or I should say seabed, that is shallow enough for us to be able to install all these fixed bottom systems. And then it becomes a floating system, which are largely being done with concrete, which will require a lot of forms to be built. So a lot of work for carpenters there. And then another interesting tidbit is that on the onshore side, and we have reason to believe that this will happen with offshore as well, carpenters actually play a key role in wind blade installation. It's a big occupation that wind developers hire carpenters to do the actual installation of wind blades. So lots of work for carpenters, lots of different types of activities for carpenters in lots of different segments is the key takeaway there. So here's some good news about carpenters. And it really just sort of, we saw the wages earlier, and you can reference back to it, but carpenters are making $32 an hour as a median wage in Massachusetts, and that's again compared to $25.75 an hour for all occupations. And it's a job that does not require any kind of advanced degree. So a high school diploma or equivalent is sufficient for carpenters, and because it's an apprenticeship program, it does not require any previous work experience. I will say one of the keys to, and you can see that typical on-the-job training is an apprenticeship. One of the keys to being ready for that apprenticeship, it does require some math, obviously. There are a number of calculations that carpenters have to do. And if you've ever spent any time with a carpenter, you'll know that they love the phrase, measure twice, cut once, right? So that you don't want to be wasting a bunch of wood. So those measurements and calculations are extremely important, not just for lengths, but also making sure that you're complying with engineer specifications. There are some common certifications and licensing requirements. So there's a OSHA, which is Occupational Safety and Health. That's the 10-hour OSHA 10, which is done over a couple of days. The Building Performance Institute provides a lot of good training around different techniques for carpenters to be building more efficient homes, things like double stud walls, for example. And then there are opportunities also for supervisors, right? As you move up in the construction industry to become a construction supervisor. We noted it's a couple of months to get that for licensure with 3 years of prior experience. So some important certifications there. So let's talk a little bit about the knowledge, skills, and abilities. So obviously a good knowledge of wood and other types of engineered materials that you can use in replacement of wood. I think we can all sort of understand why that would be important for a carpenter, as well as different types of construction techniques and those safe working practices. And that's really where some of that OSHA training comes in. I mentioned the mathematics, and for a lot of these occupations, we're going to come back to the calculations that are required. We're really talking about algebra, right, is sort of the key math skill there. So a focus on ensuring that folks coming through a pipeline are getting sufficient support around algebra is something that can really help them engage in this career. So there's a lot of skills around the equipment, right? There are lots of different types of woodworking skills, or I should say tools and equipment. And sort of understanding how those work and familiarity with those tools is incredibly important, something that's picked up in that apprenticeship program typically. You need to be able to interpret blueprints and instructions. This is a really key component, right? Oftentimes these are being, that there is a professional services type occupation that is developing those types of plans. So whether that's, an architect or an engineer providing load calculations or other types of blueprints and plans and instructions, these need to be followed precisely in order to make sure that everything comes together. Really understanding different standard measurements, specifications, and instructions. So this could also include, both English and metric systems, as well as selecting appropriate materials and knowing the strengths and weaknesses of using different materials for different applications. So all really important sort of abilities that are picked up by carpenters over their time. Now, carpenters is sort of an interesting occupation in terms of the pay spread, where we see, pretty wide pay spread, as well as a pretty wide spread in terms of healthcare benefits and retirement benefits. So, there is, a strong carpenters union in Massachusetts. I should note that many of the construction trade jobs that will be associated with offshore wind and many of the commercial buildings that we're talking about are very likely to be unionized. And in residential applications, that unionization is much lower. From a training perspective, that does sort of change how we might think about preparing folks for these careers. So union apprenticeships tend to handle most of the skill and certification requirements once a person meets their minimum required standards for their entrance exams. So the work of the communities might be to prepare more individuals for that apprenticeship readiness, to make sure that they're ready to enter into that apprenticeship program. And then there are also non-union apprenticeship programs and other types of training programs that are offered throughout the state that have very similar requirements, but where there are also other opportunities for partnership on a training aspect. Obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, it should be noted that union carpenters are going to have much higher incidence of the wages and benefits. However, we still see that 60% of carpenters receive healthcare benefits from their employers, and 70% are receiving some sort of retirement benefits. So here we see multiple different pathways into this industry with some specific skill requirements that are necessary. But a very strong area of focus for clean energy careers is carpenters. So next, we're going to look at crane and tower operators. Now, crane and tower operators have a few different applications that we can focus on in Massachusetts, where we'll see some significant growth. So the first that I'll mention is offshore wind. And one of the things that I mentioned at the outset was that offshore wind provides job creation opportunities for a wide range of not only construction jobs, but other types of operations and manufacturing and fabrication types of roles. So if you imagine sort of an offshore wind farm, right, the assembly of that farm, there are a lot of things that happen in the port, right? So you have some activities that happen outside, then components are shipped in, and a lot of that assembly happens right at the port, and then that's brought out to sea, and then the final assembly happens at sea. Crane and tower operators are important for touching a product. These are big, huge, very heavy things, right? So crane and tower operators are critically important at each step where something is being moved, right? So if you are looking at turbines that are very, very not cheap, that need to be moved from land to a vessel, a crane operator is going to be doing that, and it's a very high risk maneuver because you are moving something that is extremely expensive. And the more times you have to touch it, the more risky and more expensive it is. So all of that marshaling activity, all of that bringing pieces together to bring out to sea for that final assembly is going to require a large number of crane and tower operators. Other heavy construction and port development, right? So as we start thinking about different sites for that fabrication, different sites for that marshaling, different sites for that port activity, there's going to be significant upgrades and investment into the ports themselves. And I should mention other infrastructure that maybe is directly or indirectly connected to clean energy, where there's going to be lots of investment in infrastructure where you'll have significant activities around crane and tower operators. Also for commercial building construction, you know, when you see the big cranes around Boston and some of our other cities, there are crane and tower operators there supporting those commercial building projects. So these are skilled workers who have some discrete licenses that we're going to get into. And again, a low educational barrier of entry where a degree is not required beyond a high school diploma or equivalent for these positions. So generally speaking, employers do like to see some familiarity with sites. And so crane and tower operators, they generally like to see some experience, though it doesn't need to be highly experienced folks, but they like to know that somebody has, it's not a hard and fast requirement, but they generally like to see people who know their way around a yard a bit, right? And have some sort of understanding of what job sites look like. The on-the-job training, we call it a medium on-the-job training, which means that's sort of like that up to 5 years of training to really become skilled and proficient, and a number of common certifications and licensing requirements. So you can see the different types of crane operators and the licenses and certifications that go along with those, and the times. And all of these are valuable licenses. And the good news here is that you can see is that none of these are really months and months long, right? So the longest ones are sort of the shorter duration for up to 8 weeks, but you know, some of them are even just days or hours long. So some you know, important accessibility notes there. These are common certifications that are available. In terms of knowledge, again, math comes up, right? So math is going to be important across all these occupations. It's a critical knowledge area. Safety is really, really important. So you're moving things that are incredibly heavy, could very easily kill a person if they're dropped on them, and have very high value, right? These are very often very expensive precision pieces of equipment. So I mentioned before, safety is paramount. And then, not surprisingly, the operation of cranes, right? Do you actually know how to operate a crane? That's really important. So having low risk opportunities to practice that can be really important. For skills, really understanding the ins and outs of how to use the crane. How is it designed to be used? What are the different components that go into it? And how is it actually the proper way of using the crane? But beyond that, these folks are often required to maintain these. So if something goes wrong, knowing how to resolve that issue and fix that issue and troubleshoot in the field. So those areas of maintenance and repair are also really important. You're the person there. If something fails, it can be very expensive to keep that offline. You can't always get a service mechanic in. So knowing the basics of how to keep that thing running is very, very important. And then the abilities, really, this is moving load, right? That's what you need to be able to do. You need to be able to move load without breaking it or hurting anybody. So the operating engineers would be there's 2 locals in Massachusetts, local 4 and local 98, would be representing the crane and tower operators on the union side. There are a number of healthcare benefits and retirement benefits through union membership. Again, this is an area where we think a lot of the work in and crane and tower operators could be unionized. So again, a focus around that apprenticeship readiness and engaging with local labor unions on that pipeline could be really valuable. There are certainly non-union crane and tower operators as well, and there are pathways for that type of growth in addition to the union apprenticeship programs. Okay. Next, we'll go to pile drivers. So pile drivers and divers are going to be really critical for the offshore wind sector. All of the foundation work, and when you think about sort of the people who are sort of welding at sea or doing the other diving work, those are all the pile drivers and divers occupation. This is really, we're talking about infrastructure and all of the different things that go in infrastructure. So as I mentioned before, the offshore wind sector, other types of key critical infrastructure, bridges, roads, transmission, right? Commercial buildings, that's a big one too, for commercial buildings, and of course with ports, hugely important. There are also a number of opportunities, not just in the immediate sort of direct installation of the offshore wind industry, but also for inspection, for scour protection, for other things that go into that work. The pile drivers and divers are a key component of that. There is a little bit of overlap here where pile drivers are definitely learning welding, and it is an increased skill that they are learning. There is some overlap and occasionally some jurisdictional disputes when we get in with the labor unions, with the iron workers. There's some overlap with that welding space, but the pile drivers and pile drivers local 56 on the union side, they are actually affiliated with the carpenters union. So as you're thinking about, if you're thinking about any kind of apprenticeship readiness or working with unions, there is an opportunity to sort of look at a couple of different occupations and that type of a connection. So again, high school diploma or equivalent on the entry-level education. Previous work experience is not required, and it is again a moderate on the job training exercise. The Massachusetts Pile Driver Apprenticeship, again, whether it's union or non-union, does require 7,000 hours of on-the-job training and 640 hours of classroom learning. So when we think about that time window, that's the apprenticeship window. A lot of people don't know that apprenticeships are paid. So that's not saying you need to do 7,000 hours and 640 hours that's unpaid. That's all part of a paid apprenticeship. But when you complete that is when you become the journey level worker. And then you start with that dedicated pile driver operator certification. So again, a lot of use of mechanical tools, building and construction materials. So a lot of tool operators training, a lot around sort of just these large scale heavy duty construction equipment, as well as inspecting those and understanding how to operate and maintain those, and then operating the pile drivers and other heavy construction equipment. So it's really, this is the heavy construction aspects here. Obviously the health, again, the healthcare and retirement benefits through union membership are quite high. And so, clearly that's a route where a lot of this work will be happening. This is an occupation that does tend to have fairly high healthcare benefits and retirement benefits as well overall. So wind turbine technicians, another interesting one. These come a little bit later, but we are sort of moving forward very quickly with our offshore wind installation in Massachusetts. So soon we will be needing these wind turbine technicians. These are the folks who service the wind turbines after they're built. There's some interesting aspects to this job. Usually there is some certificate or licensure. The GWO or Global Wind Organization training is increasingly being identified. It's the specification in Europe, and it's increasingly clear that that will be the specification here in the United States. And it requires really a year or more of long-term on-the-job training. Really, these are folks who need to understand all the different systems for how offshore wind or how wind turbines work. So it's really understanding all the different aspects of it. It's troubleshooting and testing that equipment, and it's being able to adjust, repair, and maintain those turbines. Very high rates of healthcare benefits, very high rates of retirement benefits. Now, it's not clear yet how these crews will be staffed. So there are opportunities where there could be sort of day trips in and out to service the turbines, but many are also suggesting that you could have a 2-week on, 2-week off shift, where you are actually living on a boat at sea for 2 weeks, continually maintaining the turbines, and then off for 2 weeks. That will have an important impact on where these folks are sourced from, and the type of work environment clearly that folks will be engaging in. So it's not totally clear yet. It'll be interesting to see how the developers are thinking about their maintenance programs, but certainly wind turbine technicians is going to be an important occupation for folks leaving our shores to maintain these systems. Next, we have installation workers. Installation workers are, as you can see in the photo here, are really important in the building space. They're doing the air sealing work that's preventing the leakage from homes and commercial buildings and industrial buildings to the outside, keep that heat in. You can see here that that piece of wood is not nearly doing as good of a job as that extruded, looks like polystyrene insulation there that's being put in. But the installation workers are there, really making sure that they are, really sealing up the house and making a good thermal envelope. The entry level requirement are very low. Really, no level of education requirement, no previous work experience, and is a fairly typical to have a short-term on-the-job training. There are some important certifications here. Often these are folks working in crawl spaces and attics. So an OSHA confined spaces 8-hour training is critical. The OSHA 10-hour is also another important safety training. There is a weatherization crew chief certification that's a 4-day certification after 6 months of doing the work. And there's lots of sort of on-the-job and classroom training that is focused around some of the, whether it's Building Performance Institute or other training around the proper technique for installing the installation. Here the knowledge around really understanding the different types of materials for their application, and the knowledge of buildings and structures to make sure that you are covering all the important areas and that you've built that good thermal envelope. And then really on skills, this again comes back to the measurement and cutting, right? You really want no gaps, right? That's the key here. So making sure that that's very precise is critical. For abilities, really what we're looking at here is the ability to really install these installation materials, and then to inspect and troubleshoot any of the issues that you're having with those structures and materials as the installation happens. So about 60% receive healthcare benefits, about 80% receive retirement benefits. There are installation locals that are largely working in the commercial space in terms of labor unions. The residential space is largely not, especially single family homes, largely not unionized. One of the key things about installation workers is that in the process of doing this work, there's a real ability to learn about all the other trades that are working in the building, right? So understanding some of the other building performance upgrades, the carpentry, the roofing, the drywall and plastering, some of the other skilled trades. So installation workers could be also an interesting standalone job, but could also be an interesting sort of pathway job to those higher performance buildings. So last but not least, we will talk about hazardous materials removal workers. This is particularly important when we think about asbestos in older buildings and some of the retrofits. Not much in terms of the entry-level requirements or previous work experience. But a couple of certifications worth pointing out. There's an asbestos removal license that's required. It's a 2 to 5 day training for that. And RCRA, which is a federal law around hazardous waste management training, that's 4 hours. So these jobs have a slightly higher than average starting wage, but really over time, their wages are not really keeping up with many of the other occupations that we discussed. However, a very important occupation, especially one that helps people get to build their knowledge and skills around both safety and build the built environment. So lots of important information there. As I mentioned, oftentimes these are benefits that are available through union membership when those positions are unionized, and some very important, obviously, safety training around working with these types of materials. So I think we can probably do about 6 to 8 minutes of questions before I turn it back over to the Mass CEC team to talk about some upcoming webinars, maybe 5 minutes. So I will, I'll keep this slide up, I guess, and open the floor to any questions. I'm just seeing in the chat here the note from the Mass CEC team about the importance of a driver's license, and it's not necessarily having a car. And this is really an important observation. A driver's license is very important, and especially when we think about the single family market, being able to get to lots of different homes is really critical. And folks can raise their hand or put a question in the chat. Great. So we have a question. What opportunities will there be for high school students to explore these careers? I don't know, Janelle, if you have any ideas about, sort of thinking about exposure and awareness, and if that has any implication for these solicitations. I have a couple of ideas that I can throw up, but why don't we listen to what Mass CEC has planned first?
For us, a lot of our focus, because of the nature of this kind of work, has been on vocational schools. And so there's, because what they're allowed to work with is a little different. So a lot of this is exposure to that. For students who are 18 and over, we also offer, like, for us, it's an internship program, but it's also connecting to some of the training providers. Some of the summer jobs are not necessarily in these careers, but some of them are like admin in construction companies. So it's a way for people to get exposed in terms of job shadows, or talking to unions, like having people come in and discuss what their work is. Unfortunately, I think this is a weird place where the labor laws make it so some of these things anyone under 18 couldn't do in high school, unless their family member made them do it. But that is kind of where we stand in terms of like high school exposure and what I've seen in the field.
And I'll just add, the state right now is providing a lot of funding for many of the vocational schools to not only teach during the day a carpentry program or an electrician or HVAC program, but they're also opening it up at night so that adult learners who are changing careers may be able to pick up some of the stuff that is in the vocational school tracks. But I would say they're not real customized to the careers that we're necessarily talking about. I think the major categories like HVAC are being covered, but maybe not the heat pump. There's not usually a shorter version of it for just heat pumps, even though we're starting to see that in other states like New York. And I would think with the new $10,000 incentive, a lot of HVAC companies are going to be looking for people to help with their heat pump expansion work.
And we will be talking a lot about that in our next session, where we'll get into that in a minute. But I also just would, on this note, I do think it is important for us to be thinking about awareness of these different types of occupations all the way into middle school. because middle school is really where we're starting some of the pre-algebra and algebraic thinking, and having some contextualized learning. And a lot of kids are like I was, right? Like XYZ is nice, but I'd like to have some practical application to understand why I'm learning it. And so I think there is a good opportunity for curriculum expansion to be focused on some of the applied, clean energy occupational usage of some of these core skills, even into middle school.
Does anyone else have any more questions? I don't see any hands. Well, I guess maybe we'll move on and just give a teaser for some upcoming webinars that we have. Phil was mentioning that he's going to be doing a second part of this that will be covering some additional high priority occupations. So that's coming up on April 26th at 10 a.m. Phil will be covering electricians, which, by the way, I think across all the different sectors, electricians are probably where our biggest number of new jobs will be created, because we need it for every piece of it, for upgrading, building, like even single family homes need a lot of electrical upgrades, installing electric vehicle chargers, offshore wind storage, like basically every part of this, solar storage, is going to definitely need electricians. Then Phil's going to be talking about HVAC installers and sheet metal workers, energy assessors, and mechanical engineers. And then we also, so today, just today, we are posting, Janelle mentioned that we have a new solicitation for planning grants. This is an opportunity for partnerships. It could be training providers for any of these kinds of careers. It can be a partnership with community organizations that reach people in environmental justice communities. And it's mainly to pull together a partnership and to give you $50,000 basically to create the partnership and the connections with employers that would take on employees who've gone through that training program, either an apprenticeship or looking to hire. There's definitely a lot of interest in pipelines of training to a lot of these careers, but we always want to start with the employers. Second, we have some, New York's been doing this partnership model for priority populations for a number of years now. And there's some just really fantastic and honestly inspirational workforce training partnerships that have gone on in New York. And so we're going to have two webinars highlighting a few of those. The first one's going to be on April 27th with Wilden, Energy Solutions, Soulful Synergy, and Non-Traditional Employment for Women. So these are all up on our equity workforce page. You can register for any of these, and all of them will be recorded just like this one. And so please spread the word to other people. And I do encourage everybody to sign up for our workforce development email distribution lists. Again, there's a way, if you go to the bottom of that page, there's a way, it shows you how to sign up for that. And so we look forward to seeing you guys again and spreading the word. So thanks so much for joining us today. And thanks, Phil. Great job.
Thank you.